Hey everyone, I'm Heidi from Hands Occupied here with another knitting video for you today. In this video, we are going to be talking about everyone's favorite subject in the world when it comes to knitting, gauge and tension, particularly as it applies to Intarsia knitting. We're covering this because for real, in my emails and DMs on social media, I get more questions about how to make Intarsia colorwork knitting look a little better. So I thought I would address this subject today. The other question I get asked most about Intarsia is how to deal with weaving in the ends, but that's a subject for another day. First things first, why does Intarsia knitting sometimes look squished? What do we mean by squished? So this is a circle, and a squished circle is an oval. Squished is what I mean by squished. So in knitting, the first thing we are supposed to do when we start a new project is knit a gauge swatch. We look at the pattern, figure out the recommended yarn, needles, and stitch your pattern for the swatch, and then we knit up a little rectangle that is, or should be, at least 4 inches by 4 inches. After wet blocking, letting our swatch dry completely, we can measure how many stitches and rows comprise an inch in our knitting, and hopefully our gauge is the same or pretty close to that listed in our pattern. Let's say you measured your blocked swatch and the number of stitches and rows per inch that you're knitting at isn't the same as what's listed in your pattern. That's referred to as not getting gauge. You can try switching up your technique or switch to a smaller or larger needle and swatch again to help you get gauge. Particularly for knitting garments like sweater vests, knitting gauge will make the difference in your finished project fitting or not. And for knitting Intarsia color work, getting gauge also helps ensure the design you're working hard to knit into your project looks correct and not squished or stretched. You may have encountered this in your knitting career so far, but knitting stitches aren't square, and in Intarsia, they're even less square. You may remember this from school geometry, but the difference between a square and a rectangle is the fact that squares have an equal width and height measurement, whereas rectangles have a different width and height measurement. Despite the charts we work from regularly featuring graphs with squares to indicate each knitting stitches aren't square. They don't have an equal width and height. And that brings us to the idea of aspect ratio in knitting. So what is aspect ratio and how does it impact my knitting? An aspect ratio is a proportional relationship between a shape's width and height. Most often in daily life, you'll hear the term aspect ratio referring to the size of the image on your TV, phone, or movie screen, describing just how rectangular the image is. Is it a tall and thin rectangle? Is it short and wide? Square images have a 1-to-1 aspect ratio because they're as wide as they are tall. A tall and thin rectangle might be 1-to-10, and a short and wide one could have a 10-to-1 aspect ratio. On average, knitting stitches clock in at about a 5-to-4 aspect ratio, meaning they're slightly wider than they are tall. Stitches knit with Intarsia colorwork tend to have an even more rectangular aspect ratio. Why? Because there's tension happening horizontally in each row when we change colors. In the example of the Spiral Hill sweater vest, the gauge is 19 stitches and 28 rows over 4 inches. To calculate the aspect ratio of our stitches based on this gauge, we simply divide 19 stitches by 28 rows, width divided by height, to get about 0.678. Again, pardoning the school math here, we need to convert this into a fraction before reducing it to get our aspect ratio. 0.678 equals 678 over 1,000, which equals about 6.5 over 10, or 3.25 over 5 with rounding. The short explanation for what to do next to get your aspect ratio is simply to flip the numerator and denominator, the top and bottom numbers, and you're in business with a 5 to 3.25 aspect ratio. The long explanation is not going to interest everyone, so in another video and blog post, I can break down the math in detail for the die-hard knitters who want to know. For whatever reason, colons are used when aspect ratios are discussed rather than slashes. Just heads up there. So for people whose brains have maybe shut down because they're just not here for the numbers, that's okay. This concept is another way to help explain why gauge matters, and aspect ratio comes into play especially when it comes to Intarsia knitting. That's it. So let's take a second to talk about graph paper versus knitting graph paper and the impact that can have on Intarsia design. Everyday graph paper, the paper many folks will have on hand or first reach for, particularly when drawing up their first Intarsia knitting design, is square. Often charted patterns we find in knitting publications and books feature graphs with square cells. So if we grab a generic pixel art drawing app or standard piece of notebook graph paper to draw up our first Intarsia design, the picture we're drawing might be accurate to that app or piece of paper, but when knit up at an aspect ratio that's not the same one-to-one as the chart we're working from, the finished Intarsia design looks a little squished in comparison. Looking at the chart for the Spiral Hill sweater vest and reference image in the book is a great example, especially because they're side by side. The chart used in the book features graph paper with a 1-to-1 aspect ratio. I designed the pattern with the real 5 to 3.25 aspect ratio in mind, but for printing a 1-to-1 chart was used, which isn't uncommon. As you can see, Spiral Hill looks sort of tall and oddly proportioned in the chart compared to the hill in the movie. That's because the chart knits up at that 5 to 3.25 aspect ratio, but the chart depicts a 1-to-1 aspect ratio. Here's another example to help explain aspect ratio. If you've ever resized an image on your computer, you'll know that it's easy to accidentally make it look a bit off. If you grab one side of the image to resize it, you can easily make an image look squashed or stretched. If you grab the image by the corner, you're scaling it, which changes the width and height of the image at the same rate. Rather than making the image just taller or wider, scaling it makes the image get proportionally wider and taller, preserving that aspect ratio. So if this concept is feeling kind of challenging or kind of fuzzy to you, please reach out in the comments to let me know what specific questions you have that I can help clarify. I'd really like to help solidify this concept if it's not quite clicking. If you don't have any questions though, you could do me a favor by giving me a like if you liked what you saw and subscribing for even more video tutorials. I've been Heidi. Thank you so much for watching.